So first of all, of course, I want to thank the three of you for your contribution. And for me, let's say the goal or the ambition of this panel is really to, let's say, try to ask a bit more precisely, okay, how do we understand this production of housing, this production of the city and the territory today? What are possible perspectives of understanding that? And I think that the three case studies, I'm going to call them, or the three talks, they've really contributed to that. And I would like to structure the beginning of the debate, but I'm of course also opening to questions from the hall along the three, let's say, sub-themes that I've introduced in the beginning of when I was introducing the panel. And the first question that I would like to dwell a bit upon is indeed, how do we understand the agency of the production of the city and the territory? So, in other words, what is driving the production of the city and the territory, and through which lens can we understand it? And I will maybe just start in the follow-up that you've been presenting, because Erik, when I was listening to your story about the Swedish housing production, of course, very obviously the role, the agency of the welfare state was very important. But I must admit that I was also a bit triggered, because at a certain moment you also pointed to the role that construction companies played in that. And I was wondering if we could dwell a bit upon that, if you can take the microphone from Nelson for a moment, if we can dwell a bit upon that. I mean, on the role that indeed construction agents, let's say, and I would even say construction methods and techniques that they play in the, let's say, in the production of our territories, of our housing territories in your case.
Yeah, so this I just touched upon, but it is a very critical issue, and because the building of the welfare state in Sweden, many times when you look at the way that it was constructed, it goes back to the 30s when an accord was struck between the government and the industry, where the birth of the union movement, agreement with the government that said that we should work together to build the welfare state. Yeah. Usually we are only focusing on the political dimensions of this, the politics and the policy, but I've become more interested in what happened specifically in the housing sector when the industry said, we will follow your politics, we won't challenge your politics. And what happened was that it created some of the richest individuals in Sweden, and it also created some of the most powerful companies in Sweden. And this was a period where, as you saw in the curve, the housing production increased. The construction companies understood the possibility to propose that they shall promise a certain product. And this is where the architect was opted out of the process. And we now have a situation in Sweden where the municipal housing owners or the private housing owners or the production of housing is done in direct negotiation with these housing the construction companies.
So on the one hand, Erik, if I understand you well, you could say that it was, let's say, positive in terms of the large amount of production that is created. Indeed, this European welfare state is a sort of contract between, on the one hand, the state, on the other hand, the industry, but very often also still the sort of civic society, let's say, was also part of that contract of the European welfare state. So you are saying, on the one hand, this created an enormous housing production, if we may believe your statistics. In a very short term. So in that sense, we can say that it was successful, let's say. But you're also pointing to a sort of flip side, where indeed, in some kind of way, two of the partners in this contract, namely the state and let's say the market, to say it rapidly, they ended up in a sort of tight situation, tight dialogue, let's say, which would take off maybe without consulting the civic society, which was this third part of the welfare state. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in most part. And the interesting thing, what's happening now, is that with the dismantling of the welfare state and the rise of individualism and consumerism, we've seen that the individual has entered into a new relationship with the construction company, but on very unequal grounds.
Yeah.
So this is the continuation.
I'm going to go, maybe we can come back to that later. I'm going to go to Nelson, because I would also like to hear a bit from Nelson. Of course, Nelson, you gave us, well, two case studies, two very different case studies, but I would also be interested to also, let's say, dwell a bit upon, okay, what was driving, let's say, this production of the city. You didn't touch too much upon that, to be very honest. You spoke of the two case studies, but maybe it's good to now become a bit more precise. Okay, what was the spark, as it were, but also what was controlling that these case studies, both Malaguera, sorry, okay, I need to. So both the Malaguera area and the other, the Indian example, let's say, how could they be understood? I mean, what was driving that, but also what was keeping a certain kind of control over these developments?
I think in both cases the key issue was land and ownership. So in both cases, I mean, the fact that the emphasis on single family houses as opposed to the multi-layered apartments was instrumental, let's say, to give lands and land ownership and land tenure as something that would be emancipatory. Yeah. And then another, what then is absolutely crucial is the issue of density. Because of course, if you think about, I mean, you cannot just waste land, so to speak, right? Well, in places like Mumbai, it's crucial, and every square centimeter is precious. So how can you make, on the one hand, so preserve some social, let's say, practices, special practices as well, but they'll also cater for the what people used to call the big number, right? Yeah. How do you do that? And so that's when this operation, which of course it was developed by the World Bank. So the World Bank was sponsored in the case of India, and in the case of Portugal was sponsored by the governmental agency and municipality. So how do you enable people to become, say, owners of their house? And that was when this sort of very sophisticated hierarchical system, let's say, came to play a big role, and when to a certain extent the role of experts was crucial in the whole operation, right? Because designing something that could sort of mitigate this anxiety to become owner on the one hand, but also to manage such a precious asset as land. So it's a very complicated equation. So this, I think that at that moment, and that we were talking about the moment of the the neoliberal turn, so the World Bank of all people, I'd say, they were indeed promoting that. And this brings me to the famous Hernando de Soto idea of enabling people by making what they own fungible, meaning that what they own can become a collateral to become players in the market. So these cases, to a certain extent, let's say, have this sort of hybrid condition. On the one hand, they become assets, they become a commodity, but also on the other hand, they became a possibility of being really citizens and expressing this idea of singularity.
Yeah, you had, I think, a quite paradoxical sentence in your presentation where you said that private property was a way to avoid that housing becomes a commodity. Yeah. Let's say this shows, I think, in that sense also a bit of the paradoxical situation within which these projects are thought, are conceived, let's say, but most probably also point to a strong sort of controlling agent, let's say, the World Bank, the state, but also these experts that you are talking about, which need to sort of secure, as it were, this precarious balance, you could say as well.
Just in a very, very brief note, that BDD shows that I showed that the British built in the 20s, now is 120 of these blocks are going to be demolished in 1 month to give way to the Trump Tower and things like that. And this is because they are owned by the state housing agency, so they can do that. Whereas these micro properties in the sites and services, nobody can do anything there, and people can really claim and have really a claim for that.
I'm going to Adolfo right now, yeah, indeed, and I would also like to ask him, of course, okay, about what is driving the production of the territory of the city. I'm going to say the production of the city of housing, and in your narrative, of course, the territory played a very important role. The territory as an assemblage of resources, I would say. Material resources, social resources, natural resources. I think that was very much the, let's say, the story that came across with me, that is that when we think about the production of our cities, of housing, that we should very clearly take this, let's say, these qualities and these characteristics of the territory as a set of resources into consideration. For me, the question could become also with the different capitals that you were, the Harvey frame that you were proposing. To me, the question could become, yeah, but who's going to, let's say, again, who is the agent in this? Who's going to decide on what sort of resources to extract, protect, preserve, let's say? I was wondering if you could say something about that. I mean, it's clear that the territory as an assemblage of resources is, I think, a fruitful lens to look at the way that our cities are produced and reproduced, let's say. But the question is, who are the main agents in this? Maybe you could say something from your research on that.
Yeah, I think that the answer to your question, I could say that there is no single agent, but there is a single driver, which is capital, let's say in abstract words.
Which is?
Capital. Capital in general, right? And the resources required to make this capital grow and continue to flow. The thing is that a long time, the final agents or executors of that intervention on the territory is changing. And this is very clearly readable in this territory. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were companies, LKOB or Boliden, who were the ones intervening directly into the territory by building these company towns or building the infrastructure. But after the strikes of the 60s, 70s, those competences were transferred to the state and to municipalities. So there was a change of paradigm, change of context, and those new agents, they were not able, or still today, they are not able to cope. For instance, in the case of the mining sector, to cope with the gap that exists between the economic cycle of the mine, that is reviewed year after year, and the time that takes to build a city, settlement for the miners. So they find themselves, municipalities, trapped in the situation where at some point one mine closes down, so that housing stock is not required anymore, so people get out of that territory, and there is a big housing stock void that no one has the resources to maintain. And after 10 years, the mine opens up again because the global price of mineral changes, so there is the need of new workers coming in, but that housing stock is obsolete, and they don't have the resources either to renew it or to refurbish that or to build new settlements. So the capital is the driver, I could say, but the executors are changing a long time. And now the critical situation we have now is that the final executors, the agents, are not able to cope with a very rapidly changing context in this specific economic sector.
Well, it's in some kind of way, I would say, a very negative story as well, and the more remarkable because it is in Sweden. I mean, because indeed you have the state as a sort of correcting factor, which has been constantly there. It's remarkable that they didn't do that in relation to this big capital, which was indeed exploiting the resources of the country as well. I would like to go maybe back then to let's say go back to Nelson for a moment and ask a bit more about the role of design, let's say, in all of this. I think that Nelson's case is showing that most clearly. Many of the stories that you've been presented, they could be read as well. The role of design, and that's of course something that we very often hear in the architectural press as well, is decreasing, is evaporating, is non-existent any longer. Erik already made some kind of a comment in that direction as well. Nelson, you seem to suggest a different role for design, for architectural design, still operating in these very different conditions. I was wondering if we could speak a bit about that.
Well, indeed, I mean, especially because I focus also in two cases of the so-called incremental housing approach. And so incremental housing, of course, suggests that there is something that is there at the beginning, but that nevertheless, let's say, has embedded some sort of let's say, genetic code that accommodates growth and change through time. So, I mean, and this goes a little bit beyond what the idea of John Turner was sort of promoting, and this idea of, you know, the bottom-up thing. I mean, you just let people do whatever they want, and you know, and they will thrive. Yeah. And what I find interesting in these incremental housing schemes is that they are indeed, and especially the sites and services, I think they are one of the most fascinating cases of a simultaneous operation of top-down, because they are designed to the millimeter in all different senses, in terms of an economic operation, in terms of a social, let's say, management, so to speak, but also in terms of design, but also of a bottom-up initiatives, because I mean the way that the whole community eventually consolidates is, of course, very much related with how the social interactions can take place in a space which was designed. So this sort of, let's say, simultaneous operation, top-down and bottom-up, I believe that it's when you see design at play. And also another thing is that in both cases there was a deliberate agenda to create sort of, let's call it like that, sort of an inclusive city. I mean, in the sense of creating income, social mix of low income, high income, and all that. So how do you design that? I mean, is that something that just happens by chance? I don't think so. It's really something that you need to design. It's not, does not really mean that always works. And in this case, for instance, Caesar was trying to mitigate all differences by creating this one single type, but then still catering for different income groups, and some changes then eventually surface.
It seems also that in this operation there's also a sort of recalibration of what design is and what it should do, let's say as well. I think that's also, let's say, emerging from your let's say, case studies that you've shown, that let's say the way that we understand design in such a condition is something different from how we understand design in a more conventional sense, let's say. I would like to go back to Erik as well, because Erik was, I must say, rather negative about, let's say, the role of design, suggesting that architects and, I'm just going to say, urban designers, they were marginalized, let's say, and that now this was a sort of entente between the state on the one end and construction companies on the other end. So I would like to go a bit back to your assessment of that, or your analysis of that condition. Ask indeed how you see, let's say, the future role of architecture, of urban design, then within this housing production that you were talking about.
Just to clarify, I meant that we're being marginalized in the processes of construction and design of the city, but they're still very instrumental in the design of the cities. And I think what we've spent in Sweden the last 20 years in the design community is working with the spaces between the buildings and designing this new neoliberal latte loving city. And so every design solution looks the same regardless of context or location. But it has also been a very successful in the market dominated situation process. I think that there's plenty of value for design now, actually seeing the relationship between the individual spaces and the collective spaces. I think that there's need also to understand processes in a different manner. I think they have also become appropriated, and there are very few future visions presented in Sweden of what architecture can be. Everything is for a very specific situation, very currently, and I think that's where the future architects need to see themselves as rewriting the regulations, collecting the new empirical data, understanding the conflicts that are existing right now to propose new solutions, instead of just tweaking what is really old knowledge.
So in some kind of way, let's say, rehearsing a bit the process that you described of the immediate post-war period in Sweden, where also this empirical research and this, let's say, forefront thinking or progressive thinking about what urban living could be was really at stake, if I understand you well.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Then I want to go just to Adolfo and ask one more time the same question. You described a rather negative condition, let's say, of capital developing the territory and then the state or all kinds of state institutions being forced to take over. That's what you are saying. I think it's a very recognizable, by the way, scenario. I think it's not only a scenario of Sweden, but it's also scenarios that we see elsewhere where industries that develop large parts of urban territories then close down or migrate or move to other territories, let's say, and leave a sort of landscape there, which then can be taken care of by the state, or by some other collective agents, let's say. How do you see the role of design? I just wanted to go.
I think with designers we have a big role and a big field to develop in the future. Because I see ourselves not only designing objects or artifacts or pieces of architecture themselves, but also designing processes themselves. I mean, and processes when it comes to a more, I don't like to use the term sustainable, but I haven't found the proper one yet. But let's say if we agree in using sustainable way of developing things in the future, I could say that designing processes of a change between resources and demands. This is something that we need to take care of, because at the end, much of the obsolescences we are seeing today in architecture in general, they have the very deep reason into the changing conditions of the relation between demands and resources available for them to be provided.
So we're also going to take a few questions from the hall. I got one question here for you, Erik, from Raphael. Raphael is asking, you've talked about contemporary Swedish housing as being sustainable in a cynic way and uniform. Could you develop what are the features and spatial categories of contemporary spatial housing? That's the question.
Well, I think maybe this is referring to the example of the thick building that I brought, and the thick building is a result of two processes. One is the urban situation that's tried to create kind of a return to the 19th century bourgeois city planning, and the resulting apartment within that. And what is happening is there's a lack of spatial design within the apartment, and it becomes more of a relationship between the location, which is tied to real estate value and private property, and then to the balcony. And the balcony is where one either looks at the water or is looked at from the street, and everything else that happens in the home isn't really accommodated.
Well, I already got a signal that we are through our time. So maybe just to, let's say, dwell a bit upon, as a conclusion, then dwell a bit upon what you were saying, Erik, is that indeed there are a whole set of norms and standards, I would say, which have to do with land value, but which also have to do, indeed, with energetic ambitions, you could say, which also seems to drive this production of the city, and which most probably also should be taken into account as true actors and agents, let's say, of how our cities look nowadays, particularly cities like the North European cities, where of course this is a very important agent as well. We're already through our time, but I hope we can continue the discussion in the hallways, let's say. I want to thank our three speakers for, I think, excellent contributions and an excellent debate as well. Thanks a lot.